The wrench slipped from Ray's grease-stained fingers and clanged against the concrete floor. 11:47 at night. His garage smelled of motor oil, and old country music drifted from a crackling radio. But standing in the doorway was a woman who didn't belong here. Connie, billionaire CEO, his best friend for 20 years. Her evening gown was wrinkled mascara streaked down her cheeks like dark rivers, and her voice cracked on 4 words he never expected to hear. Please be my husband. Not a joke, not a metaphor. She needed him to marry her. The woman who owned half the city was begging a small-town mechanic for his name on a marriage certificate. And somewhere behind those desperate eyes, Ray glimpsed something else. Something she'd been hiding far longer than tonight. What would drive a woman who had everything to ask for the one thing money couldn't buy? Ray stood frozen, the echo of his dropped tool still ringing against the walls of his small garage. The fluorescent light above flickered once, casting strange shadows across Connie's face, and for a moment, he thought he might be dreaming. She looked nothing like the woman he'd seen on magazine covers or watched giving interviews on business channels. That Connie wore armor made of silk and confidence. This one stood barefoot, her expensive heels dangling from one hand, her designer dress stained with something that looked like champagne. The radio behind him crackled through the chorus of an old Johnny Cash song, and Ray found himself unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except stare at the woman who had been his closest friend since they were 16 years old. She stepped further into the garage, her bare feet making soft sounds against the oil-stained concrete. Her shoulders were shaking, whether from cold or something else entirely Ray couldn't tell. Ray. He'd seen Connie cry exactly 3 times in 2 decades. Once when her father died. Once when she lost her first company to a hostile takeover at 24. And once late at night after too much wine, when she confessed she didn't think anyone would ever love her for anything other than her money. But this was different. This wasn't the quiet, controlled grief he'd witnessed before. This was desperation raw and unfiltered, the kind that strips away every mask a person has ever built. Ray finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. He asked her what happened, what was wrong, why she was here at nearly midnight, looking like her entire world had collapsed. Connie didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked past him to the old workbench against the wall, the one covered in tools and spare parts, and a framed photograph that had been sitting there for years. She picked up the photo, her fingers trembling slightly, as she traced the faces of 2 teenagers grinning beside a rusted 1978 Camaro. That was the summer they'd rebuilt that car together, the summer before everything changed, before her family's business exploded into an empire, and before Ray's father died and left him with nothing but this garage and a mountain of debt. She set the photo down and turned to face him. The words that came out of her mouth were measured, careful, like she'd rehearsed them on the drive over, but still couldn't quite believe she was saying them. Vincent wasn't who she thought he was. The man her mother had spent 2 years pushing her toward the man she was supposed to marry in 3 weeks had never loved her at all. He wanted her company. He wanted the 30% voting shares that would transfer to her spouse, according to her father's will shares, that would give him enough power to merge the company with his own and effectively erase everything her father had built. She'd found the emails tonight, hundreds of them, plans and strategies and cold calculations about how to manipulate her, how to isolate her from anyone who might warn her, how to make her believe she was lucky to have him. Ray felt something hot rise in his chest, a protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. He'd met Vincent twice at events Connie had invited him to, despite his protests that he didn't belong in rooms full of people who wore watches worth more than his truck. Both times, something about the man had felt wrong, like a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, like words that sounded rehearsed rather than felt. But Ray had kept quiet because Connie seemed happy, and her happiness had always mattered more to him than his own instincts. Now he wished he'd spoken up. Now he wished he'd done something other than stand in the background of her life, watching her make choices he couldn't understand. Connie explained the rest quickly, her voice gaining strength as the shock of discovery gave way to the practical mind that had built an empire from her father's modest holdings. The wedding was scheduled, the invitations sent, the merger announcements already drafted and waiting. If she simply called it off, Vincent would find another way in. He'd bought loyalty from 3 board members, maybe more. Her mother wouldn't believe her, wouldn't even listen, because her mother had wanted this marriage so badly, she'd ignored every red flag Ray could see from miles away. The only loophole, the only way to protect herself and her father's legacy was to marry someone else first, someone Vincent couldn't control, someone who didn't want her money or her power or anything except to see her safe. Ray understood then why she was here in his garage at nearly midnight asking for the impossible. She needed a shield, and she'd come to the one person she trusted completely. 20 years of friendship, of late-night phone calls and holiday dinners, and being the only one she could truly be herself around. 20 years of Ray loving her in silence, never saying a word, because she deserved more than a mechanic with grease under his fingernails and a daughter who still cried sometimes for a mother who wasn't coming back. He thought about Tessa, asleep upstairs in the small house attached to the garage, 8 years old, and still young enough to believe that everything would always be okay as long as her daddy was there. He thought about the life they'd built, quiet and simple and safe, and how easily it could all be disrupted by stepping into Connie's world of corporate warfare and family politics. But then he looked at her face, really looked, and saw the girl who'd sat beside him in detention after punching a kid twice her size for making fun of his second-hand clothes. He saw the young woman who'd shown up at his door the night his wife died, who'd held Tessa while Ray fell apart, who'd quietly paid for the funeral, even though he'd tried to refuse. He saw 20 years of moments, big and small, that had made her the most important person in his life, outside of his daughter. And he heard himself say the word that changed everything. Heard it leave his mouth before he could think it through or talk himself out of it. Okay, he would do it, but only on paper. Only to protect her. Nothing more. Connie's face crumpled with relief, and for a moment Ray thought she might collapse. She steadied herself against the workbench, one hand pressed to her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. She thanked him in a voice barely above a whisper, and something flickered in her eyes that Ray couldn't quite identify. Gratitude, certainly, but underneath it, something deeper, something she looked away too quickly to hide. Ray told himself it was just the stress of the night, just the emotion of finding out the man she'd planned to marry had been lying to her for years. He told himself that the flutter in his own chest meant nothing, that he was simply helping a friend, that this arrangement would be temporary and clean and wouldn't change anything between them. 3 days later, they stood in a county clerk's office, 2 towns over, signing papers that made them legally husband and wife. Connie wore jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and Ray thought she looked more beautiful than she ever had in photographs from galas and charity events. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, watched Tessa for the afternoon, and Ray told his daughter only that he had some important paperwork to take care of. He would explain later, when he figured out how to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. The clerk smiled at them like they were any other couple, asked if they wanted to kiss to seal the deal, and Ray felt his face flush as Connie laughed and said, "Maybe later." They walked out into the afternoon sunlight as husband and wife, and Ray couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped off a cliff with no idea where he would land. The plan was simple. Connie would move into his house temporarily, just long enough to make the marriage look legitimate if Vincent tried to challenge it. She would continue running her company. Ray would continue fixing cars, and they would live parallel lives under the same roof until the threat had passed. Then they would quietly divorce, and everything would go back to normal. That was the plan. Ray repeated it to himself like a mantra as he drove home, as he helped Connie carry her suitcases up the narrow stairs to the guest room, as he watched her look around his modest home with an expression he couldn't read. 5 suitcases. She'd brought 5 suitcases for a temporary arrangement, and Ray didn't know whether to laugh or worry about where he was going to put them all. The first morning was a disaster. Ray woke to the smell of smoke and the piercing shriek of the fire alarm, and he found Connie standing in his kitchen, surrounded by the charred remains of what might have once been eggs. She looked horrified and embarrassed, and somehow younger than her 36 years, and Ray couldn't help but laugh despite the chaos. She confessed that she'd never actually cooked for herself, that she'd had housekeepers and personal chefs and takeout menus memorized, and that she'd wanted to do something nice for him and Tessa to say thank you. Ray gently took the pan from her hands, opened the windows to let out the smoke, and started making breakfast, while Connie watched him with an expression of genuine fascination, like he was performing some kind of magic trick. Tessa wandered downstairs a few minutes later, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and stopped dead in the doorway when she saw Connie sitting at their kitchen table. She knew Miss Connie, of course. Miss Connie was the pretty lady who sent her beautiful dresses for her birthday and came to her dance recitals and always smelled like flowers. But Miss Connie didn't live here. Miss Connie lived in a big house far away with fancy cars and people who opened doors for her. Tessa looked at her father with the particular intensity of a child who knows something is different but hasn't figured out what yet, and she asked the question Ray had been dreading. Why was Miss Connie sleeping in their guest room? Ray knelt down to his daughter's level and told her the truth, or at least a version of it that an 8-year-old could understand. Miss Connie needed help with something important, and she was going to stay with them for a little while. It was like when Tessa's friend Lucy came for sleepovers, except this sleepover might last a few weeks. Tessa considered this explanation with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence, then shrugged and asked if Miss Connie wanted to see her rock collection. Just like that, the interrogation was over, and Ray watched his daughter drag Connie upstairs to show off her treasures, feeling something ease in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. The days that followed were an exercise in adjustment. Connie, it turned out, did not know how to use a washing machine, had never been inside a grocery store without a personal shopper, and could not parallel park to save her life. Ray found himself teaching her things he'd taken for granted his entire life, simple domestic skills that most people learned as children, but that wealth had shielded her from ever needing. She approached each lesson with the same fierce determination she brought to business deals, and Ray found himself impressed by how quickly she learned despite her initial disasters. By the end of the first week, she could make toast without burning it, and had memorized the route to Tessa's school and back without getting lost. Tessa warmed to her faster than Ray expected. His daughter had always been cautious around new people, a protectiveness that had developed after her mother left and never came back. But Connie was patient in a way that surprised him, sitting through hours of Tessa's detailed explanations about ballet positions and rock classifications and the complicated social dynamics of 3rd grade. She attended every dance practice sitting in the folding chairs with the other parents, her designer purse looking absurdly out of place beside their sensible handbags. She never complained about the hard seats or the repetitive music or the way the studio smelled faintly of sweat and rosin. She just watched and smiled and clapped when Tessa managed a particularly difficult turn. Ray started looking forward to coming home in ways he hadn't since before his wife died. The house no longer felt empty when he walked through the door. There were sounds now, laughter and conversation, and the particular chaos of 2 people trying to figure out how to live together. Connie had taken over the kitchen table as a workspace, her laptop and files spreading across the surface like an invasion, and she would look up when he came in with grease on his hands and exhaustion in his bones. She would ask about his day. Really ask, like she genuinely wanted to know about the stubborn transmission he couldn't crack, or the elderly customer who paid him in homemade cookies. No one had asked about his day in years. One night, Ray came home late after a particularly difficult repair and found the house quiet and dark, except for a soft glow from the living room. He walked in to find Connie asleep on the couch, a children's book open on her chest. Tessa's blanket draped over her legs. The book was the one Tessa always asked him to read before bed, the story about the bear who couldn't find his way home. And Ray realized that Connie must have taken over bedtime duties when he didn't return on time. He stood there for a long moment watching her sleep, watching the way her face had softened into something unguarded and peaceful. Something shifted in his chest, something that felt dangerous and inevitable, and Ray forced himself to look away. He covered her more securely with the blanket, turned off the lamp, and retreated to his room before he could do anything stupid. But the moments kept accumulating, small and seemingly insignificant, yet impossible to ignore. The way Connie laughed at his terrible jokes, even when they weren't funny. The way she rested her hand on his arm when she talked, casual and warm. The way she fit into his life like she'd always been there. Like the years of separation had been a detour rather than the main road. Ray caught himself watching her more than he should, noticing things he had no business noticing. The curve of her smile, the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, the sound of her voice drifting up from the kitchen while she helped Tessa with homework, patient and encouraging in a way that made his heart ache. He reminded himself daily that this was temporary, that she was a billionaire and he was a mechanic, that she would go back to her real life soon enough, and he would be left in the wreckage of a heart he'd spent 2 decades protecting. But the reminders grew weaker, with each passing day, harder to believe when she sat across from him at breakfast with bedhead and no makeup, and one of his old flannel shirts hanging off her shoulders. Harder to believe when she looked at him with something in her eyes that he couldn't name and didn't dare hope for. The cracks began to show in small ways. Ray noticed that Connie sometimes stared at her phone with a heaviness in her expression, her jaw tight, her fingers hovering over the screen, like she was deciding whether to throw it across the room. She never talked about these moments, would simply slide the phone into her pocket and smile when she caught him watching, but Ray could see the toll it was taking. The texts from her mother were relentless, a constant drumbeat of disappointment and accusation. The board meetings grew longer and more contentious, leaving Connie drained and quiet on the evenings after them. She was fighting a war on multiple fronts, and Ray hated that all he could do was stand on the sidelines. One evening he found her sitting alone in the garage, perched on the old stool where he usually sat while working on engines. The radio was off, the lights were dim, and she was just sitting there, staring at the wall of tools, like they held answers she couldn't find anywhere else. Ray sat down beside her without a word, and for a long moment, they just existed together in the silence. Then Connie told him that her mother had called her a disgrace to the family name, that Vincent had sent flowers to her office with a note that said he forgave her confusion and was willing to give her another chance, that she was starting to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake, not because she regretted the marriage, but because she was terrified of what it might cost him. Ray took her hand rough and calloused against her smooth skin and told her that she was the bravest person he'd ever known, that walking away from everything expected of her took more courage than he could imagine, that whatever came next, they would face it together. Connie leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the moon rose high enough to cast silver light through the garage windows. Then Vincent showed up. Ray was picking up Tessa from school when he noticed the expensive car parked across the street, too clean and too new for this neighborhood. The man leaning against it was tall and handsome in the way that magazine models were handsome, all sharp angles and perfect teeth and eyes that calculated everything they saw. Ray recognized him immediately and felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel. Vincent pushed off from the car and walked toward them, his smile never wavering, his voice smooth as silk as he introduced himself to Tessa as a friend of Miss Connie's. Tessa, bless her instincts, moved closer to Ray and didn't smile back. The threat was delivered so politely that anyone watching would have thought they were having a friendly conversation. Vincent mentioned that he knew about the marriage, knew it wasn't real, knew it was just a desperate ploy by a desperate woman. He mentioned lawyers and custody battles and how unfortunate it would be if Ray's fitness as a father came into question. He mentioned all of this while smiling, while using words like concerned and unfortunate and for the best. Then he got back in his car and drove away, leaving Ray standing on the sidewalk with his daughter's hand in his and ice in his veins. He didn't tell Connie. He should have, he knew that. But the thought of seeing her face crumble with guilt was more than he could bear. She would blame herself. She would try to leave to protect him and Tessa, and he couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when Tessa asked for Miss Connie at bedtime. Not when the house finally felt like a home again. So Ray carried the threat, silently checking over his shoulder, more often, making sure to document everything about his life that proved he was a good father. He smiled when Connie asked if everything was okay, and he lied, and he hated himself for it. Connie was fighting her own battles. Her mother called daily, each conversation more hostile than the last. The texts arrived like missiles, accusations about betrayal and disgrace and destroying the family name. Connie would emerge from these calls with red eyes she tried to hide, and Ray would pretend not to notice while silently adding another item to the list of reasons he wanted to punch Vincent in his perfect face. The board meetings grew contentious. Vincent's allies were making moves, questioning Connie's judgment, suggesting that perhaps she needed to take a step back from leadership during this difficult personal time. She worked longer hours, her laptop glowing in the darkness long after Ray had gone to bed. But there were good moments, two bright spots that made the darkness bearable. Like the Sunday morning when Tessa declared she was going to teach Connie how to make pancakes, and the kitchen ended up covered in batter, while all three of them laughed until their stomachs hurt. Like the evening when the power went out during a storm, and they sat in the garage by candlelight, while Ray played old country songs on the guitar he hadn't touched in years. Connie sang along softly, her voice, untrained but beautiful, and Tessa fell asleep with her head in Connie's lap, while the rain drummed against the roof. Ray looked at them in the flickering light, and felt something crack open inside him, something he'd kept locked away for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He was falling in love with her. No, that wasn't right. He was admitting to himself that he'd always been in love with her, that 20 years of friendship had been 20 years of waiting, hoping, pretending that what he felt was normal. It had never been normal. Not when he'd chosen to ask a different girl to prom because Connie was already dating someone. Not when he'd married someone else because Connie was building an empire and he was just a guy who fixed cars. Not when he'd stood at his wife's funeral and felt guilty because part of him was relieved, and the relief had nothing to do with his wife, and everything to do with the woman holding his daughter in the second row. He'd buried that guilt, buried all of it, convinced himself that friendship was enough. But now she was here, in his house, in his life, and the walls he'd built were crumbling. The confrontation with Vincent came sooner than anyone expected. Connie received a letter from his lawyers, formal and threatening, claiming the marriage was fraudulent and demanding an annulment. The letter included photographs, surveillance shots of Connie arriving at Ray's house, of them entering the courthouse of the two separate bedrooms visible through windows. It was blackmail dressed in legal language, and the message was clear. End this farce, marry Vincent as planned, or watch Ray lose everything. Connie came to Ray that night with the letter in her shaking hands and tears streaming down her face. She apologized over and over, saying she never meant for this to happen, never meant to drag him into her mess, never meant to put Tessa at risk. She would sign the papers. She would end it. She would go back and marry Vincent and hate every moment of it, but at least Ray and Tessa would be safe. Ray listened to her ramble, watched her pace his small living room like a caged animal, and felt something decisive click into place inside him. He told her to stop. His voice was quiet but firm, the voice he used when Tessa was working herself into a panic and needed someone to anchor her. Connie stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped breathing for a moment as she stared at him. Ray crossed the room and took the letter from her hands, folded it carefully, and set it aside. Then he looked her in the eyes and told her what he should have told her 20 years ago, what he'd been too afraid to say when they were young and the future seemed impossibly long. He told her he loved her, not as a friend, not as a favor. He loved her, and he'd loved her since she was 16 years old and fearless and completely out of his league. The silence that followed was terrible and wonderful and endless. Connie stared at him like he'd spoken in a language she didn't understand, like the words didn't make sense coming from his mouth. Then her face crumpled in a different way than before, not with despair, but with something that looked almost like pain. She asked him why he'd never said anything. All those years, all that time they'd wasted, why had he never told her? Ray laughed a sad and hollow sound and explained that there had never been a right moment. She'd always been with someone, or he'd been with someone, or the gap between their worlds had seemed too wide to bridge. And then Tessa came along, and his whole life narrowed to the simple task of keeping his daughter safe and happy, and loving Connie from a distance had become just another part of who he was. Connie shook her head, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. She told him he was an idiot, a complete and total idiot, because she'd felt the same way had felt it for so long she couldn't remember when it started, and she'd convinced herself it was impossible for the same reasons he had. She'd watched him marry someone else and told herself it was for the best. She'd dated men she didn't love because at least they weren't Ray, at least they couldn't hurt her the way losing him would hurt. And when his wife died, she'd wanted to tell him had rehearsed the words 1,000 times, but it had felt wrong to confess to a grieving widower, selfish to think about her own feelings when he was drowning in his. They stood there in the middle of his living room, the weight of 2 decades pressing down on them, and Ray didn't know whether to laugh or cry or scream at the unfairness of it all. All that wasted time, all those years of pretending. And now, finally, here they were, and it was still impossible. Vincent was still out there, still threatening everything Ray loved, and Connie was still trapped in a web of family expectations and corporate politics. Nothing had actually changed, except that now they both knew what they'd lost. Connie reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly, but her grip was firm. She told him she wasn't going to marry Vincent. She wasn't going to sign any papers, or give up, or let that man destroy everything she'd built. But she also wasn't going to do it alone. Not anymore. Not when she finally had someone standing beside her who loved her for who she was, rather than what she was worth. She asked him if he would fight with her, really fight not just as a fake husband, but as a partner. Ray squeezed her hand and felt something settle in his chest, something that felt like coming home. He told her yes. He told her always. He told her it was about time. The battle that followed was unlike anything Ray had ever experienced. Connie transformed into a general strategic and relentless marshaling every resource at her disposal. She'd been gathering evidence of Vincent's schemes for weeks, quietly building a case, while pretending to be the naive woman he thought he was manipulating. Emails, recordings, financial documents that proved he'd been embezzling from companies he'd merged with in the past. She had everything she needed to destroy him, but she'd been afraid to use it alone, afraid of what he might do if she backed him into a corner. Now she had Ray standing beside her, and something had shifted in her. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by something fiercer. The showdown happened at a board meeting that Connie had called specifically for this purpose. Ray sat in the back of the room feeling wildly out of place among the suits and expensive watches, but Connie had asked him to be there, and he would have walked through fire if she'd asked. Vincent arrived looking confident, surrounded by the board members he'd bought, certain that he was about to witness Connie's final humiliation. Instead, he watched as she methodically presented evidence of his fraud, his manipulation, his schemes that stretched back years before he'd ever met her. She was magnificent, calm, and precise, her voice never wavering as she dismantled his reputation piece by piece. When it was over, Vincent was finished. The board voted unanimously to sever all ties with him and his companies, and criminal charges were being discussed before he'd even left the building. Connie's mother, who had insisted on attending, sat in stunned silence as the truth of the man she'd championed became undeniable. She looked at her daughter with something Ray had never seen in her face before, something that might have been respect or regret or both. The weeks after Vincent's downfall were a time of healing and rebuilding. Connie stepped back from the day-to-day running of her company, promoting capable people who'd been waiting for the chance to prove themselves. She told Ray that she'd spent her whole life trying to be what her father wanted, what her mother expected, and she'd never stopped to ask what she actually wanted for herself. Now she knew. She wanted mornings in a small kitchen, learning to make pancakes from an 8-year-old. She wanted evenings in a garage, listening to country music and watching the man she loved bring broken things back to life. She wanted a family, not the cold and transactional one she'd grown up in, but the warm and chaotic one she'd found in a house that cost less than her car. She asked Ray if there was room for her, not as a guest, not as a temporary arrangement, but as someone who stayed. Ray pulled her close and kissed her soft and certain and long overdue. Against her lips, he told her there had always been room. He'd just been waiting for her to want it. A month later, on a Saturday morning that felt like any other, Connie stood at the stove attempting pancakes while Tessa supervised with the seriousness of a health inspector. The batter was lumpy, and the first pancake came out more brown than golden, but Tessa declared it acceptable and demanded another. Ray leaned against the doorframe with his coffee, watching the two people he loved most in the world, covered in flour, and laughing at something he hadn't heard. The radio in the garage was playing through the open door, the same station that had been on the night Connie showed up in her ruined dress, with desperation in her eyes. Everything was different now, and nothing was different at all. The house was the same. The garage was the same. Ray still spent his days with his hands and engines, and his evenings helping Tessa with homework. But now, Connie was there, fitting into the spaces that had been empty for so long, filling the silence with her presence. She still couldn't cook worth anything, still burned toast with impressive consistency, still struggled to remember which laundry settings went with which clothes. Ray didn't care. He loved all of it. Loved her for trying. Loved the way she refused to give up, even when the smoke alarm went off for the 3rd time in a week. Tessa came running through the kitchen with batter on her nose, announcing that they were going to be late for her dance recital. Connie grabbed the car keys, while Ray grabbed his jacket, and there was a moment of beautiful chaos as they searched for Tessa's ballet shoes and Connie's phone and Ray's wallet. They tumbled out the front door in a mess of laughter and mild panic, exactly like any other family on any other Saturday. Ray looked at Connie across the roof of his truck, at the woman who had walked into his garage and turned his life upside down, and she smiled at him in a way that made his heart stutter even now. She asked him what he was looking at. Ray shook his head, unable to put into words the overwhelming gratitude he felt for this life, this moment, this impossible second chance. He told her nothing. He told her everything. He told her to get in the truck before they actually were late. As they drove to the recital with Tessa chattering in the back seat about her routine, Ray thought about all the years he'd spent believing that some things were simply not meant to be. He'd been wrong. Some things just needed time and courage, and a woman brave enough to show up at his door and ask for the impossible. Connie reached over and laced her fingers through his, a casual gesture, that still sent warmth spreading through his chest. Outside the window, the sun was bright and the sky was clear, and the future stretched out before them like an open road. He thought about the photograph still sitting on his workbench, the one of two teenagers grinning beside a rusted Camaro they'd rebuilt together. They weren't teenagers anymore. The car was long gone, sold to pay bills years ago. But the friendship had remained, had grown into something neither of them had expected, and Ray understood now that some things don't end. They just transform. They become something new, something better, something worth every moment of waiting. The recital was beautiful. Tessa danced like she was made of light, her small body moving with a grace that made Ray's throat tight with pride. Every spin, every leap, every careful placement of her feet was the result of months of practice and determination. She caught his eye during one of her turns and grinned just for a second before her face returned to the serious concentration her teacher demanded. Connie cried through the whole thing while insisting she wasn't crying, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue Ray handed her, whispering that she had something in her eye, even as tears streamed down her cheeks. After the performance, they waited by the stage door for Tessa to emerge, still in her costume, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She burst through the door and launched herself at both of them, somehow managing to wrap her arms around Ray and Connie simultaneously. The other parents smiled at them, these strangers who had become familiar faces over weeks of practices and performances, and Ray realized with a start that they looked like any other family, that somewhere along the way they had become one. Ray sat between them afterward, eating celebratory ice cream in the parking lot, listening to his daughter describe every moment of her performance in exhaustive detail. She talked about the girl who almost tripped but recovered beautifully, and the boy who forgot his entrance and had to be nudged by another dancer, and the moment when the spotlight hit her face and she felt like she was flying. Connie listened with the same intensity she'd once reserved for board meetings, asking questions and making observations that delighted Tessa. They were both covered in melted ice cream by the time they finished, but neither seemed to mind. Connie caught his eye over Tessa's head and smiled, and in that smile, Ray saw their whole future. More mornings like this one, more ordinary days filled with extraordinary love, more chances to build the life they'd both been too afraid to reach for. He saw birthday parties and holiday dinners, school plays and graduations, quiet evenings on the porch watching the sun go down. He saw growing old with her, their hair turning gray, their hands still finding each other across the years. The drive home was quiet in the best way, Tessa falling asleep in the back seat with ice cream still smeared on her chin, Connie humming along softly to the radio. Ray kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, this small family that had formed against all odds, and he felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced in years. Maybe ever. This was it. This was the life he'd been waiting for without knowing it. When they got home, Ray carried Tessa up to bed while Connie cleaned up the kitchen from their morning pancake adventure. He tucked his daughter in, smoothed the hair back from her forehead, and watched her sleep for a moment. She looked so much like her mother, the wife who had left them both, but she had his stubbornness and his laugh and his tendency to love with her whole heart. He hoped she would always be this happy. He hoped he could give her the life she deserved. Downstairs, Connie was waiting for him on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She handed him one as he sat down beside her, and they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The neighborhood was quiet, just the occasional bark of a dog or the distant sound of a television through an open window. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the sounds of a life well lived. Connie asked him if he ever regretted it, saying yes, marrying her, turning his simple life upside down for a woman who came with more baggage than anyone should have to carry. Ray thought about it seriously, giving her question the weight it deserved. Then he told her the truth. The only regret he had was not doing it sooner, not telling her how he felt when they were young and the world was wide open. Not being brave enough to reach for what he wanted, instead of settling for what seemed safe. She leaned into him, her head finding the familiar spot against his shoulder, and Ray wrapped his arm around her. They stayed like that for a long time, watching the night deepen, listening to each other breathe. Somewhere in the house, the old grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Sometimes the thing you're searching for has been right beside you all along. It just takes someone brave enough to ask, and someone brave enough to say yes.